Birkenau Concentration Camp, 1944 to 1945. Chapter 16. The train arrived at Birkenau that night. The cars clanked and groaned as the train came to a stop a half kilometer outside of the gates. It was a cloudy night and should have been dark, but the sky was lit up red like a bonfire. Black chimneys stood up in a silhouette against the glowing sky, shooting flames from their tops, and the smell of burning flesh filled the air. I gagged. I waited for the train to move again, to take us into that awful factory, but we didn't move. We sat for what must have been hours, all of us who could see watching the flames, knowing that was where we were going. Why were they holding us here? Was this one last torture, one last joke? Did they want to drive us to panic, to madness? If they did, it was working. The longer we waited, the more anxious I got. What was going on? Why weren't we? What are they waiting for? I said at last, my voice hoarse from thirst and fear. Don't you see the fire in the chimneys? A man said next to me. They have to finish off the last trainload before they have room for us. I took in his words, too weak to react. We were just another raw material waiting to be processed. Shoveled us in, shovel us out. I dozed again. Every time I woke, I was still in the cold train car, a dead man leaning against me. At last the train jolted and began to move, and I woke for good to a pale yellow sun rising above the distance. They were taking us inside to the furnaces. They were taking us inside to die. The train car opened. For a few steps the dead body came next to me, came with us, held up by the living as we pushed for the door. But as soon as there was more space, he fell, slumping to the floor with the others who had died on the trip. There were dozens of them, rag and bone skeletons who had perished of hunger or thirst or the cold or suffocation or overwork. We climbed over them, gulping in the fresh air outside before the capos and soldiers whipped us and shouted at us to line up. We assembled in a field just beyond the train cars, those of us who survived, looking more dead than alive. After another roll call to see which of us were still alive, the Nazis marched us towards one big brick building with chimneys. So this was it. The reality began to sink in, and I slumped under its weight. They were really going to kill us. I'd come so far, endured so much agony and suffering. I had survived the workings in the ghetto, baked bread under the cover of the night, hidden in a pigeon coop, had a midnight bar mitzvah in a basement of an abandoned building. I had watched my parents be taken away to their deaths. I avoided Amon Goth and his dogs. I had survived the salt mines of Wazika and the sick games of Trebiznia. I had done so much to live. And now, here, the Nazis were going to take that all away with their furnace. I started to cry, the first tears I had shed since Moshe had died. Why had I worked so hard to survive if it was always going to end like this? If I had known, I wouldn't have bothered. I would have let them kill me back in the ghetto. It would have been easier that way. All that I've done was for nothing. In the large empty room, we were ordered to undress and pile our striped uniforms in the center. In a different corner was another stack of clothes, silks of red, bright red and blue and purple and green, gypsy clothes. Now we knew who they fed the fires of Birkenau while we waited our turn outside. I was still crying as I pulled off my shirt and added it to the pile. The tears came unbidden, but I didn't try to stop them. Some of the other men were crying, most weren't. I didn't care. I was tired. Tired of fighting, tired of being brave, tired of surviving. They whipped us and beat us again to herd us into the next room, where shower heads lined the ceiling. I remembered what the man on the train had said, that you died fastest if you stood underneath one of the shower heads where the gas came out. Instead, I moved away from them, near one of the stone columns set throughout the room. They packed us in again, just like on the train, but there was still a little room to move. When the door clanked shut, some of the men cried out. By now, we all knew why we were here and what they were going to do to us. Some people panicked and beat on the door, yelling for the Nazis to let us out, to have mercy, to spare us. But some people cursed them. Some people just closed their eyes and muttered prayers. Some just stared off into space, waiting to die. Tears streamed down my face, tears I didn't know I had left. I slid down the column to the ground, burying my head in my hands. Mother, father, my aunts and uncles, my cousins, my friends in Krakow, I missed them all so much. We waited, but no gas came. The cries of men grew louder and more desperate. I stayed frozen to where I sat, not knowing what to think. Why were we waiting now? Maybe someone was standing on the hose, I thought crazily, and I started to giggle. Yeah, that was it. Or maybe they couldn't get the fire or the furnace going. Maybe the match kept blowing out. or the kindling wouldn't catch fire. I laughed out loud at that, and the prisoner standing over me looked down at me like I was insane. Maybe I was. The Nazis had finally broken me. It was all a big joke. All I could see that now. There was no rhyme or reason to whether we lived or died. One day it might be the man next to you at roll call who's torn apart by dogs. The next day it might be you who is shot through the head. You could play the perfect game and still lose. So why bother playing at all? The gas still didn't come. I pulled myself to my feet and pushed my way through the men until I was standing right underneath one of the shower heads. Go on! I yelled at the showerhead. Go on, do it! I dare you! I laughed again. What are you waiting for? I cried. Kill me! I give up! You win! The pipes rattled and moaned. Something was finally coming out. The men in the room got quiet, like we were all holding our breaths, and I reached my arms up toward the ceiling. Kill me, I prayed. Please kill me and put an end to this. I'm ready. Water rained down on me. Freezing water so cold it made me scream. Water, not gas. I was going to live. I laughed and cried, and so did the other men. We celebrated as we shivered, hugging one another and shaking hands, all of us granted a last-minute reprieve by the Nazis. I was alive. Chapter 17. After the shower, nothing seemed to matter as much to me. I knew it was a game to the Nazis. Kill us, don't kill us. To them, it really didn't matter. But even so, I was glad I had made it through. I had been ready to die, but when water came out of those showers, not gas, it was like I was born again. I had survived, and I would keep surviving. I was alive. The Nazis lined us up, still naked and shivering. First, they shaved our heads. With our hair gone, we all looked alike, young and old. Next, they marched us to a different room, where the soldiers waited at tables with what looked like big oversized pencils with wires attached to them. As we worked our way toward them, person after person, I could hear screams of pain ahead of us. I had no idea what they were doing to us. But they weren't killing us. That was all that mattered, I told myself. I could handle pain. By the time I got to the head of the line, I understood what was happening. We were being tattooed. I watched as the man ahead of me had letters and numbers carved into his skin in black ink with an electric needle. When it was my turn, the Nazi with the tattoo pencil grabbed my arm and started to write. The pain was awful as he dragged the vibrating needle over my skin, but I knew better than to cry out or to beg him to stop. Besides, nothing could be worse than what had already happened to me. I had been in a gas chamber. I had looked up into the shower head and waited for death to come. It had passed me by, and I was alive. A tattoo was nothing to me. Not in that moment. B3087. That's what the Nazis carved into my skin. B for Birkenau, 3087 for my prisoner number. That was the mark they put on me, a mark I would have for as long as I lived. B3087. That was who I was to them. Not Yannick Gruner or son of Oscar and Mina. Not Yannick Gruner of 20 Krakusa Street, Podgorze, Krakow. Not Yannick Gruner, who loved books and science and American movies. I was prisoner B3087. But I was alive. After the room where we were tattooed, we were taken to another room with a huge pile of old, used prisoner uniforms and told to find something that fit. The soldiers made us run, beating us with clubs if we took too long to find new pants and a shirt, so we took whatever we could as fast as we could. I ended up with pants that were too short and a shirt that was too big. But I was lucky to get a pair of wooden shoes that fit. That was important. Shoes were everything in the camps. I moved fast and I wasn't beaten. I could play the game as well as anybody. I'd made it this far, hadn't I? I was alive. When we were showered and tattooed and dressed again, we were taken to our new barracks. They were worse than any barracks I'd seen yet. The ground at Birkenau was like a swamp, wet and thick with mud. There were no floors in the barracks. There was no heat or electric light either. The bunks weren't beds, but shelves, stacked 3 tall on top of one another, and they stuffed us in again as they had on the trains. There were no mattresses, no pillows, no blankets. Just old wet straw when there was anything at all. There were so many of us, we could only lie all in one direction, or we couldn't lie down at all. It didn't matter. I was alive. I couldn't help thinking it over and over again. I felt something at my feet, deep inside the shelf, and reached down to get it. It was a scrap of colorful cloth, a bandana or a handkerchief, probably left there by one of the gypsies who had slept in the bunks before us. I tucked the scrap under my head, hoping to use some of it as a pillow against my ear, but there was something hard inside of it. I knotted the cloth and found an object hidden within, a little wooden horse. It was a simple children's toy, a rough carving that just hinted at 4 legs and a head, but it was smooth and dark like it had been played with. Some gypsy boy or girl had loved this horse, had somehow kept it with them always, right up until the very end. Had they known that they were going to die? Had they left their little horse behind so it wouldn't die with them? So some part of them might be survived and be remembered one day. "We have a boy who was 13 today," a man on my shelf said. I raised my head, as did 1 or 2 others. "Who will stand with him?" No one stirred. "Are there not 10 men here who will make a minyan with us?" "Be quiet," someone told him. "Go to sleep." "How can you care about such things in a place like this?" someone else asked. "It is even more important here and now," the man said. Someone scoffed. "Tomorrow he'll be dead. We all will. None of it matters any more." I was tired and starving, and my arm burned from the tattoo, but suddenly I thought standing in a minyan for somebody's bar mitzvah was the most important thing in the world, worth losing sleep over, worth being punished or killed. "I'll do it," I said. The men around me were quiet for a minute after I spoke, and then someone else said yes, and another, and another. When there were 10 of us, we climbed down onto the muddy floor, and the man who had first spoken began to pray. More men came down then, more than 10, until we filled the whole ground. The boy looked so young, but I knew I could only be 1 or 2 years older than he was. With a start, I realized I probably had missed my own birthday. I was 15 now, maybe even 16. It was winter, but I had no idea what month it was, let alone what day. I had been in concentration camps for more than 2 years. I looked at the boy and remembered my own hasty bar mitzvah in Krakow. I had been so young then, a lifetime ago. The ceremony was fast so we wouldn't be caught. When it was over, all the men whispered, "Mazel tov," and climbed back onto their shelves. I went up to the boy and pressed the wooden horse into his hands, the only present I could give him. The boy looked at me with big, round eyes. Had I ever been so young? "We are alive," I told him. "We are alive, and that is all that matters. We cannot let them tear us from the pages of the world." I said it as much for me as for him. I said it in memory of Uncle Moshe and my mother and father and my aunts and uncles and cousins. The Nazis had put me in a gas chamber. I had thought I was dead, but I was alive. I was a new man that day, just like the bar mitzvah boy. I was a new man, and I was going to survive.